Some might remember Jax and Reddy. And we emailed a link to their story last April, and obviously some would say, well, I wasn't here last April. I don't know what you're talking about, or maybe you just forgot. But I'll describe a little bit. Jax and Reddy, last spring, they were then in kindergarten, and they have remained fast friends. These two guys are very much alike in many ways. And when Jax's mom came to him and said, you need a haircut, Jax hatched this plan. And he thought, I am going to get my hair cut exactly like Reddy's. And then he's like, when I go to school tomorrow, the teacher's we're twins in every way. And if I get my hair cut, he's not going to be able to tell us apart. So we'll put a picture up here for you, see if you can tell them apart. And Jax's mom, Lydia, comments, she said, it just struck me as funny that Jax doesn't even notice that Reddy is a different color. Said when he describes Reddy, he never mentions it. He said, I thought with all the hate in the world today, we could use this lesson from an almost 5-year-old. And that story goes on to report that Reddy and his older brother Enoch were adopted from Africa when they were 2 and 4 years old by Kevin and Debbie Weldon, who are white. And they said, our family's not limited by race or nationality. And Reddy's dad was commenting, I think it's really cool to see that move from our family right into all of Reddy's relationships with his friends. He said, there's an innocence children have that sometimes we lose. And that perspective might bring to mind for some of us the lyrics from that song to the musical South Pacific, you've got to be carefully taught. Remember that? You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8. To hate all the people your relatives hate, you've got to be carefully taught. In the headlines, like the events and rallies in Charlottesville and more recent, remind us that some people are still teaching hatred. And we cannot be among that number. And you're going to sit there and say, well, of course I'm not. Great. But we have to be teaching something better, something more wholesome, something more healing, something that is more Christ-like. So can we strive to see there's really only one race? Race is a term, and it has been used properly to try to indicate cultural or physical differences, and probably more well-intentioned earlier in use, but sometimes now it has become divisive. We have this need for race relations, which keeps reminding us we're not relating as well as we ought. And so much that is a part of today's climate is nowhere near God's design. From the beginning to the end, the story of the Bible is the story of God's singular family, the one human race. It starts at the very beginning, the first cover, Genesis 1:27. This is the first book. This is the first chapter. It says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Every single human being you've ever laid eyes on is created in God's image. And the Bible goes in Genesis 9, which is after the flood and Noah's family, and from that family the people groups go and disperse. And chapter 10 will give you the table of all the nations that come from them. And chapter 11 you have that issue with the Tower of Babel. And it has not always been perfect. Obviously God has to disperse a prideful people. We haven't always interacted like we ought, but we're all from the same root. In Genesis 12, then, God has a promise to Abraham and to his descendants. And who does God intend to bless? He takes this Jewish group and works through them. But this is chapter 12, verse 3, the second part. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That's the intent, the design. And then you come to the New Testament, after the coming of Christ, here is a line of thought, Acts 17:26. From one man, he made every nation of men. And rather than telling the Christians, don't worry about the discrimination against the Gentiles, Paul addressed it head on. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. Romans 10:12. He's praying for the Ephesians in chapter 3, verse 14, 15. For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom his whole family in heaven and on earth derives its name. And finally, you come all the way through the Bible to the last book, the book of Revelation, and God invites the old aged apostle John to come up into heaven itself. And he essentially says, you want to see what my vision of eternity looks like? How many families? How many races? One. This is Revelation 7:9. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. I firmly expect to see every skin color, shade, tone represented in that gathering. We will make up the one human race. And I trust that you know that we are all really just one shade of brown. Okay? I think paint chips here, like I use like the 8 Crayola colors, brown, black. But there are all types of shades, right? You could say sepia, beige, tan, peach. We'll put up a picture of Raj. Raj always describes himself on Big Bang Theory as mocha or caramel. I looked up Crayola's list. They have macaroni and cheese and neon carrot. Okay? And our skin tone actually comes from what? Well, part of a big contributor is this, the level of melanin that's in our skin. We'll put up a table of the genes and the genetics and mom and dad and A's and B's, and you can see all of the different various shades that can produce a variety of skin tones in one generation. And I think the most succinct illustration I can put up here, this is an image of 2 young ladies, Keon and Remy. They are twin sisters. They were born 1 minute apart. I checked that out on Snopes. It's legitimate. Britain, I think it is. It says the pair owe their appearance to a 1 in a million combination of their parents' genes. And it says mother Kylie Hodgson and father Remy Horder both have white mothers and black fathers, and those 2 little girls are twins. Other people don't decide our value. Our skin tone doesn't determine our worth. God does. And he sees all of us. He's always seen all of us as his children. So I want to take some time and wrestle with this. How have race relations become so strained in this culture, in today's climate? And I kind of was working all through the week. I didn't give you numbers, but I think I put 4 on this one. Here's one reason. Some of us, some Anglo-Americans, we don't see what all the fuss is about. But this has been an issue. And I'll share some thoughts from a gentleman. This is Ken Weitzma, and he wrote an in-depth article this is actually the current issue of Outreach magazine, which I just read. I got this after I'd already decided on the series: equality, justice, civility, race, and the gospel, healing our wounds, bridging the gap, reconciled. I thought, how timely is this Outreach magazine? And in this article, Weitzman, he informed me of some things in our country's history of which I was not aware. He was talking about the FHA generating before and after World War II home loans for couples, families to be able to move out of the cities. And yet it says minorities and immigrants were often denied access to the same opportunities, thus shaping America's cities into large parts of what they are today. And I'm reading this article, and he discussed convict leasing. I don't know if you're aware of this practice. It says, the amendment that outlawed slavery left a loophole regarding freedom of incarcerated men and women. Minorities were often arrested for frivolous crimes like loitering and vagrancy. And I tend to not put all my stock in one source. Somebody says that. So I start looking elsewhere for other sources to validate that. Digital History was the place that I found. They said between 1846 and 1928, convicts were invariably leased to prominent and wealthy families who worked them on railroads and in coal mining. One state actually paid companies to work their prisoners for much of the time the system was in place. No state official was empowered to oversee the plight of the prisoners. Business had complete autonomy in the disposition and working conditions of convict laborers. And it goes on to describe, they said, sometimes the mines and the plantations that used convict laborers had secret graveyards where the bodies of prisoners who had been beaten or tortured were buried. Convicts were made to fight each other, sometimes to death, for the enjoyment of the guards and the wardens. And there's several sources, not the only one. It said, it's no secret that convict leasing system targeted blacks. Most historians agree that around 90% of the convicts in the system were African American. With little food and water and only scraps of clothes hanging on bony bodies, the workers labored in mucky and oppressive environments like swamps, sweltering cotton fields, chained together by day, abused by guards, sleeping in cages at night. In several states, the mortality of the prisoners, the rate was 25%. And sometimes I want to raise my white hands and say, what's all the fuss about? This is what it's about. This is where it took root. And you can say, yes, that's in the past now. Yes, we can and must do better now. But these are examples of the history that framed families and lives and attitudes that are, in how many ways, vastly different from my own. Source said, there's no denying the evils of slavery and discrimination in America's past. In some way, it haunts us to this day. There are still people who judge others and treat them unfairly based solely on skin color or ethnicity. And it came to the point that you know is true. As long as the sinful nature is present in this fallen world, there always will be. It's our job to make those numbers less. You can also argue that Charles Darwin has contributed to this strain. Darwin's words and his theories have been used, whether accurately or egregiously, to fuel racism. That evolutionary mindset that some are superior and others are inferior, that's fertile soil for a racist attitude. And I'm reading through the Answers in Genesis article, and it was titled, Are There Different Races? He said, in the 1800s, before Darwinian evolution was popularized, most people, when talking about races, would refer to the English race or the Irish race, etc. This all changed in 1859 when Charles Darwin published his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. And I looked it up, and I have a picture of the actual flyleaf of the actual book, and it's very small print, but that's exactly how it's entitled. And it goes on in Answers in Genesis, Darwinian evolution was and still is inherently a racist philosophy, teaching that different groups or races of people evolved at different times and rates. So some groups are more like their ape-like ancestors than others. Leading evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould claimed biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. The Australian Aborigines, for instance, were considered the missing link between their ape-like ancestor and the rest of mankind. This resulted in terrible prejudices and injustices toward the Australian Aborigines, and went on to talk about putting pygmies on display. And I'm reading through this, and I'm uneducated enough to think, he didn't really say that. They didn't really put people in the zoo. So I thought, I got to look it up for myself. And you go through Darwin's own words, Descent of Man, it's online, page 201, is actually what he said. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state than we may hope than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon. Instead of the present between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. And you can meet one of these Africans. This is Ota Benga from CNN. That little tiny white line at the side says Library of Congress photo. During September of 1906, nearly 250,000 New Yorkers flocked to the Bronx Zoo to behold a young African, Ota Benga, a so-called pygmy, who was exhibited in an iron monkey house cage. And you know who fussed about that? The ministers and the masses. The people who came to see it were uncomfortable. It says, the human being happened to be a bushman, one of a race that scientists do not rate high in the human scale. But to the average non-scientific person in the crowd, there was something about the display that was unpleasant. And the preachers in the air raised such a ruckus that they released him to the custody of one of the ministers. If you ever heard anything about a man named Adolf Hitler and his ideas on the Jewish race, it's the same root concept. It has contributed. The stereotypes, personal past experiences, that kind of stuff contributes to the strain. Have you ever been guilty of stereotyping anyone? Law enforcement, we got a picture of those guys. Students of Asian descent taking a math test. I appreciate the wisdom behind these words here. I thought that was well said. The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. When folks are influenced by this Darwinian stereotypical thinking, you're programmed to judge somebody by the exterior rather than the interior. You make a broad judgment based on what you see. Am I guilty of that? And I'm going to ask this group, what does God look at? And you're going to tell me what 1 Samuel 16:7 says. Here's Samuel going to anoint a king, and he's looking at Jesse's oldest, Eliab. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Personal experiences that people have had in this country. Dave Stone at Southeast, he preached a sermon, and he shared the story. There was a time in Gandhi's life when he as a young man was considering the claims of Christianity. Read through the New Testament several times, decided he wanted to see what it was like, came to America and found himself in the American South, where he was not allowed in restaurants or restrooms because of the color of his skin. And he later wrote in his personal journals that he rejected Christianity not because of Christ, but because of Christians. And we know Romans 12 tells us differently. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. And the last one that I picked out of a long list was this misunderstanding of reconciliation versus conciliation that contributes to this strain. One author asked, I thought this was a very good question. He said, he's talking about racial reconciliation. He said, what are we reconciling to? When was the time in this country when blacks and whites all got along just swimmingly? He said, we need rather radical transformation of hearts on both sides, or all sides. It's not just a black and white issue in this culture anymore. God reconciled us to Himself at the cost of His Son's blood. And Ken Witzma, in that article, Why Race Belongs in Our Gospel Conversations, he said this, the gospel isn't simply good news we hear, it's good news we become. We aren't simply recipients of grace, but agents of grace. And all of those reasons and how many more, that all contributes to why we have to be preaching and teaching reconciliation, but it's in a biblical sense. We're going to help reconcile lost people, hurting people, angry people to God who loves them. He loves them all as His children. That's why Jesus came to break down all of these barriers, and the closer you and I come to Christ, naturally the closer we are to each other. This is Ephesians 2:14. For He Himself is our peace, He being Jesus, who made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in His flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in Himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace. And in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which He put to death their hostility. And if you and I belong to Christ, we're part of that movement. We are trying to bring reconciliation between people and God. This is 2 Corinthians 5:18 and following. All this is from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And He has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making His appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. We're the representatives of Christ in this culture, and we have opportunities to share the life-changing message of the gospel. And that's a healthy relationship with God, and that helps foster a healthy relationship between people. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter the shade or tone of their skin. We can help change the narrative in the nation and in the world. And I wanted to finish with that question, and how can we, and I'm giving you choices again, impact or decrease the racial tensions today in our little corner of the world? That's what we're talking about. What can I do here now? And I think, again, I think I listed 5 of these. First one is you have to engage. You have to be in the conversation. You have to be involved. I don't know if some will remember the scene of the ship's commander, the bald-headed guy on the bridge, swearing at Tom Cruise's Maverick character to get engaged. You have to engage. You have to get in the fight. You might remember our own kids' chorus standing up here imploring you, James 1:22, don't just merely listen to the word. Do what it says. Don't sit in our comfy pews and say, well, it's never happened to me. Silence is equated with consent. To be honest, I was initially uncomfortable. We went to the square in Newark a while back to march on Sanctity of Life Sunday and hold those cards, and it's uncomfortable. People looking, but it needs done. It needed done then. It needs done today. So does this. What did Jesus do when He walked into the temple confines and He sees what's going on with the selling and the abuse and the people who were being neglected? He, shall we say, got involved. If you say, I'm not skilled, I don't have information, and I meant to put the site up, I didn't put it up there, answersingenesis.org/racism. They had several good articles. Answersingenesis.org/racism. I had to number this too, but it's probably really 1A. You have to denounce white supremacy. What you see in Charlottesville and elsewhere, that has to stop. You can't be a part of that. The sin of racism has to be stamped out. There's just no place for it. God does not show favoritism, Acts 10:34, but accepts from every nation the one who fears Him and does what is right. From every nation. James 2:9, if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. And 1 John 4:20, if anyone says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he is a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And don't even start with, well, who's my brother? Because Jesus has all kinds of stories for that. Everybody is your brother. Okay? And the individual on the cover here, Brian Loritz, he's telling us, he said, stewardship your power. And he's speaking to those of us that Dr. Tony Evans refers to as Anglo-Americans. He says the first thing you need to do is realize you're white. And because of that, you're an image of historical power in our country. Steward that well. Third in this list, let's make peer friendships with people from other cultures? Get to know somebody or some people who have a different skin tone, a different ethnic, cultural background. Know them better. This is Nathan Joyce. He says, being face to face washes away the stereotypes and the rhetoric that divides us. And you can go to Acts 9:40, and God is preparing Peter to cross some bridges, and he sends him. He says, you're going to go spend some time with the tanner, Simon the tanner, who did a job that was just against every law the Jews had, touching dead bodies and what have you. He said, you're going to spend some time there, and you're going to learn what it is to be around people of a different group, and then we're going to go even further. And I make this point here to say, make this a peer, not just some needy person that we go help. Okay. Philip in Acts is chasing after the chariot. Who's in the chariot? The Ethiopian eunuch. If you were an onlooker in that and you could see this conversation, who would appear to be the power player? The guy in the chariot riding along in comfort, or the guy running along the side in flip-flops? Now, yeah, the Ethiopian eunuch needs salvation. He needs that. But he didn't need anything else from Philip. He's his peer or more in every other way. And that's an interesting point. People will sometimes bring this up when you go on a short-term mission trip or you go help downtown. You know, they say, well, there's a possibility. And it could happen. People who have gone are very quick to say, they give us more than we give them. You understand that when you're there. But if you're not careful, it could be, what are you asking me? I went and helped that person. I gave this to that person. We benefited this group and picked them up. That sometimes fosters the attitude. I find a peer, an equal, somebody who doesn't need me as much as they need God. And you can start early. You can expose kids, family in positive ways, festivals, events. Dave Stone suggested this. I trust we do it. He says, pray for divine appointments to cross paths with other tribes. Because you might say, it's kind of tough, and if you pray for that, it's going to happen. And I looked up Columbus's website. I was going to give you like Columbus 2018 cultural events. They still had 2017 posted. But there are ways to look and see events. Exposing my kids to different neighborhoods and foods and music and art. And by this, please, I don't mean just like drive through the neighborhood with your windows up pointing. That's not it. You know, like getting out and sampling the food, listening to the music, asking questions. That's the benefit. That's the beauty when you're in Haiti, you're on the reservation in Arizona, you're in Spain. You actually experience a different culture with brothers and sisters of multiple shades. You know. Be sure we're sharing positive examples. And I spent some time to share some stuff from the history of this country that doesn't cast our tribe in a good light. I get that. But it's not the only story. You know, there are those examples. This is Amazing Grace. You might remember that film that William Wilberforce and the efforts that he made to abolish slavery in Britain in the turn of the 18th century. Very encouraging. Woodlawn is a movie. I didn't see Woodlawn. I'd like to. It says, Woodlawn High School, the FCA chaplain reaches the entire football team, and the football team then reaches out to the school, and then it says it sparked racial reconciliation and spiritual revival in Birmingham, Alabama that lasted for 10 years. Remember the Titans? Powerful example. And I'm thinking through this week, and I was kind of considering like my own. I would say to somebody who wrestles with this, I said, you know, my experiences, by and large, in the grocery store, in the gym, other places when I encounter people of other shades is very polite and encouraging and nothing wrong with it. And I bet if I were to share that, somebody would say, well, you need to come over here and see where it's like, because it's not always like that. And I'm going to tell them, maybe you need to come over here and see that sometimes it is. You know, there are better examples. And the last one on that list is it's perfectly fine to enjoy the diversity. We don't all have to be the same in all the details. When you're together on the essentials, there are going to be all these various nations and tribes and peoples and groups in heaven. You know. And I watched it. This was Dave Stone interviewing Dr. Tony Evans. The two men did a teaching series on the Woodlawn movie, and they're obviously there in the gym. And Tony Evans, he's telling Dave Stone, and Tony says, he's not asking you to like soul music. He's not asking me to like country and western. Thank God. That's what he said. He says we can all be unique as long as it's all under the authority of God's rule. Be who God made you to be under His authority. It's not our purpose or intent to make a carbon copy of our culture. We're called to make disciples of Christ. I think perhaps none has had the influence on race in America that Martin Luther King Jr. has had. The country will take time to acknowledge, honor his contributions. I'm going to finish up the way he did. April 3rd, 1968. If you recall the last words of his last speech, the night before he was assassinated, the article says, he fought for racial reconciliation, but he did it as a child of God and a reconciler of Christ, and we need that framework. These are his words. And then I got into Memphis. And some began to say the threats or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to get up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And I like the way Bill Womack worded his comments on those efforts. Martin Luther King Jr. consistently framed the civil rights movement in spiritual terms. His letter from Birmingham jail is one of the most powerful and explicitly Christian writings of the 20th century. Sadly, racism is still with us, but it certainly should not define us. And the church must set the example in the 21st century. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we would continue to come before you humbly and reverently, to be aware of that which has happened in our past, which has formed us knowingly or unknowingly. And Father, we understand the great joy and release and freedom and unity that comes from being together in your word and your truth, in your grace, in your forgiveness. Father, we pray for those who cannot see it, who don't want to experience it, who are unable to grasp that. Pray that we would be your agents of change in some regards and restoration in others, that we would come together in our understanding of your message, your gospel. Thank you for sending Jesus Christ to reconcile all men, all women, all boys, girls, all nations and peoples and tribes and languages to you, to your love, to your eternity. It's in His name that we pray. Amen. We always encourage you, challenge you, remind you that you do have an opportunity this morning to take that most important step to reconcile your own heart and soul to God. And if you know that you need to make that confession or you need to come and share and minister with us publicly, here's this invitation. Let's stand together. We'll sing, "O Come to the Altar."
Jesus is calling.
it's bad. And speaking out there, if you have a product there's several bags of what we have out there in the parking lot, and you say, well, it didn't do anything. So if you know a better product or what you use at home, if it's effective when it's this cold, let us know, because it's just tough to find something that works in this temperature. And temperatures, I don't want to put those little boxes on the thermostats, but I understand why people have those locked boxes now. Schedule, that's the button you want to push. And it could have been somebody outside our church, but schedule, bottom left, return to schedule. We came in this morning, one of the furnaces turned clear off. It was 53 in there. So, that's going to create problems we don't want. So if you come in and say, why is everything all locked up? I can't get in it. That's why. So there's a little schedule button, and we'll return that. They're all programmed. They'll take care of themselves, but bear that in mind. If you are serving in the rotations, if you haven't seen the pages on the table in the foyer, they're out there. And if you are serving in a nursery or would like to, there's a sign-up, a commitment page in the nursery, or we can continue with the rotation as it is. But it's always nice to send that invitation to people. If you want to be a part, you can go back there to the nursery and put your name in the hat, so to speak. Appreciate that. So I'll give it to Jeff. Or anything before you pray?
Everything for youth group is normal tonight. As for parents' sports tonight, I'm kind of giving you guys like a heads up of what we're teaching. I am basically a week ahead of Kevin right now, so tonight we are talking about homosexuality and what the Bible says about it, and how we can converse with people that are pro-homosexual movements. The important part is, and it goes back to what Kevin said this morning, we have to know how to engage these people on a level of love. We have to know how to engage everybody on a level of love and not persecution or looking at them hatefully. We need to know how to talk to them and bring the love of Christ to them and to anybody. So that is what we're going to be focusing on tonight in that talk. So again, if there's anything you want to bring to your kids prior to tonight, I have the last chance. Father, we just again thank you for this time that we can be together, that we can come and listen to your word and hear what you have to say to us and listen to your spirit and your word. And Father, I ask that as we go from here that you give us your eyes. You teach us how to love people the way that you love them. That you don't see color, you don't see race, you simply see your children. Father, I ask that you give us your eyes, that we can do that we can talk with people, that we can engage people on a level that they are a child of God just like we are. And Father, again, I just thank you for this time, and I thank you for the people that are here that are willing to listen to this. And again, I pray so much that you go with them, that you go before us, and you clear the path for us, Father. That the conversations that need to happen, that you give us guidance to do that, and that you also give us the courage to engage those conversations. Father, we love you and we thank you. And it's all this that we ask and praise in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Let's close this morning by singing The Bond of Love.